Picture this. It's 1907, and New York City is hours away from financial collapse. The most powerful men in America, J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, banking titans who'd spent decades mocking a woman they called the Witch of Wall Street, are now standing in her office, hats literally in hand, begging for her help. The woman they're begging, she's 73 years old, wearing a black dress she's owned for a decade, sitting in a bank vault surrounded by trunks of papers because she refuses to pay rent for a proper office. Her name is Hetty Green, and she's about to write a check for $1.1 million to save their asses. Tonight, we meet the woman who became the richest in the world by refusing to play by anyone's rules but her own. If you're watching with tired eyes and an overthinking mind, this story is for you. If you really enjoy these bedtime journeys through history, please like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I always love knowing where these stories are keeping you company. Tonight, we're meeting Henrietta Hetty Green, a woman who looked at Gilded Age America with its obsession with fashion, society ball, and building 40-room cottages you use twice a year, and said, "That's idiotic. I'm going to make money instead." While other wealthy women were spending fortunes on jewels and competing over who could wear the most elaborate hairstyle without toppling over, which honestly sounds like a structural engineering problem, Hetty was reading financial newspapers, buying undervalued real estate, and lending money at rates that still made her wealthier than almost anyone in America. While women were fighting for the right to vote, Hetty already had something more immediate: financial power. Real, liquid, undeniable power that made the most powerful men in the country come to her for advice. Advice she gave freely, which honestly was more generous than they deserved. The newspapers called her a witch because she wore plain black dresses and didn't waste money on society games. They called her a miser because she was frugal, while men were building marble palaces they'd visit for 3 weeks in summer. They called her cold because she didn't smile and flirt and pretend to be less intelligent than the men around her. You know, the usual punishment for women who refuse to perform helplessness. But here's what they also called her: when their banks were failing, when their investments went bad, when entire cities needed loans, when the economy was collapsing, they called her, hats in hand, asking for help. This is the story of how a girl who learned to read financial papers at age 6 became the richest woman in the world, how being called a witch was really code for "she won't let us control her," and how the greatest revenge is dying worth $200 million, while the men who mocked you are still paying interest on the loans you gave them. Henrietta Howland Robinson was born on November 21st, 1834, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, into exactly the kind of family that 19th century romance novels would describe as of good standing, which was code for they have money and they'd like you to remember that, preferably in writing. Her family had made their fortune in whaling, which in the 1830s was basically like being in tech today, except instead of apps that let you order food while lying in bed, you were harpooning massive sea creatures and turning them into lamp oil. Less convenient for the consumer, significantly worse for the whales, but extremely profitable if you could stomach the moral implications and the smell. New Bedford was essentially the Silicon Valley of whale murder, and the Howlands and Robinsons, Hetty's family on both sides, were major players. We're talking multiple ships, international trade connections, the kind of wealth that let you build a house with more rooms than you could count on both hands, and still have fingers left over for pointing at poor people and feeling superior about it. But here's where Hetty's story diverges from what you'd expect for a wealthy girl in the 1830s. Most girls of her class were being taught to embroider, play piano badly enough to be charming but not well enough to be professional, speak French just adequately to sound impressive at dinner parties, and generally prepare to become decorative wives who'd look pretty in parlours and produce heirs on schedule like some kind of aristocratic factory. Hetty's grandfather, Gideon Howland, looked at his granddaughter and apparently thought, "You know what? I'm going to teach this 6-year-old about compound interest instead, which is either remarkably progressive thing or a form of child abuse, depending on how you feel about teaching kindergarteners about bond yield when they should be learning their ABCs. Gideon would sit with young Hetty and read her financial newspaper, not fairy tales, not children's books, the actual Wall Street Journal equivalent of the 1840s, with all its thrilling discussions of railroad stocks and commodity prices. It's like if modern parents skipped Goodnight Moon and went straight to explaining cryptocurrency to toddlers, except Hetty's financial education actually made sense and didn't involve buying digital tokens of cartoon apes for reasons no one can adequately explain. Hetty apparently loved it. While other little girls were playing with dolls and hosting pretend tea parties, Hetty was analysing market trends and calculating profit margins. While they were learning to curtsy without falling over, she was learning to read a balance sheet. By the time she was a teenager, she could spot a bad investment faster than most adult men, which was lucky for her and extremely threatening to literally every man she'd encounter for the rest of her life. Her father, Edward Mott Robinson, also made sure Hetty understood business, not because he was some enlightened feminist ahead of his time, let's not give him too much credit here, but because Hetty's only brother had died in childhood, which meant she was going to inherit everything whether Edward liked it or not. He could either prepare her to manage the fortune or watch it disappear after his death into the hands of whatever man she married, and Edward was too practical to let family money get wasted just because of something as trivial as his heir being female. So Hetty got an education that's absolutely unprecedented for girls of her era. She learned accounting, investment strategy, property management, and the art of reading financial statements, like some girls learn to read tea leaves, except Hetty's predictions actually came true, instead of being vague pronouncements about tall strangers and unexpected journeys. The family was Quaker, which adds an interesting layer to this story. Quakers believed in simplicity, plainness, honesty, and generally not showing off your wealth like some kind of gilded peacock strutting around Fifth Avenue. This meant Hetty grew up in a household where conspicuous consumption was considered morally suspect, where frugality was a virtue, and where wearing expensive dresses just to show off was something shameful, basically the opposite of everything Instagram influencers would later be built on. This Quaker upbringing would later cause the press to lose their absolute minds when they discovered that yes, the richest woman in America really did wear the same black dress for years. And no, she wasn't doing it because she was poor or crazy. She was doing it because she'd been raised to think spending money on fashion was idiotic vanity, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Young Hetty's childhood wasn't all financial newspapers and compound interest calculations, though. She was also painfully aware that her parents had wanted a son. Her brother's death had devastated them, and Hetty knew, because how could she not, that she was a disappointing replacement, a girl instead of a boy, an heir who couldn't carry on the family name, someone who'd eventually marry and transfer all this carefully accumulated wealth to another man's family, like some kind of financial game of hot potato where women were the potato. Except Hetty had other ideas about that. When Hetty was about 15, her mother died, leaving her as the only woman in a household of wealthy businessmen who viewed her as a future problem to be managed, rather than a person with her own thoughts and plans. Her father, now widowed and probably panicking about what to do with a teenage daughter who could calculate bond yields in her head faster than he could, decided to send her to a fancy boarding school for young ladies. This was supposed to civilize her, presumably, to turn her from a girl who read financial papers into a proper young woman who could discuss the weather in French and play piano well enough to attract a wealthy husband who'd then take over managing her inheritance like some kind of financial relay race where women hand off the baton and then retire to embroidery. It did not work. Hetty attended the boarding school, learned all the proper accomplishments expected of a lady, the curtsying, the French, the piano, and then went right back to reading financial newspapers and calculating investment return. She'd figured out early on that she could play the game, could curtsy when expected, and make polite conversation about the weather without actually changing who she was underneath. It's like how people learn to code switch in corporate settings today, presenting the acceptable version of themselves in meetings while keeping the real person safely hidden. Except Hetty was doing this in the 1850s without any HR department to pretend they cared about authenticity. By the time Hetty was in her 20s, she was already managing portions of the family business, making investment decisions that proved to be consistently profitable, and generally demonstrating that she was better at this than most of the men who were supposed to be teaching her, which is always an awkward discovery for everyone involved. This made her simultaneously valuable and threatening. Her father's business associates appreciated her sharp mind and good judgment when it benefited them, but they were also deeply uncomfortable with a woman who could outsmart them in negotiations. It's the eternal problem. People want you to be useful, but not too useful, smart, but not smarter than them, capable, but still somehow in need of their guidance and validation. Hetty was too useful, too smart, and definitely didn't need anyone's guidance. This would become a recurring theme in her life, and the source of almost all the witch accusations that would follow her, because apparently a woman being competent is basically sorcery. When Hetty was 30, her father died. And this is where things get interesting in a way that involves lawyers, contested wills, and the kind of family drama that would make for an excellent limited series if anyone in Hollywood was paying attention to actually interesting historical women instead of making another movie about a guy with a sword having feelings. Edward Robinson left his daughter approximately $6 million, which in today's money is somewhere around $180 million. That's enough to be comfortable, one might say. Enough to live very well without ever working. Enough to never worry about money for the rest of your life if you managed it even moderately well. Enough to buy a small island or several large houses, or a truly concerning number of hats. But there was a catch, because there's always a catch when women inherit money in the 19th century. Most of that $6 million was in a trust, not given to Hetty directly, but held by trustees, male trustees naturally, who would manage the money and give Hetty the income from the investments while keeping control of the principal. It's like if someone left you a huge amount of money, but specified that you could only have the interest, and a committee of people who thought they knew better than you would make all the actual decisions about how to invest it. Like having a financial advisor, except you can't fire them and they're legally required to mansplain every decision. This drove Hetty absolutely insane. And honestly, who can blame her? She'd spent her entire life learning finance, had already proven she was better at investing than most of the men who were now supposed to be managing her money, and now she had to sit back and watch trustees make mediocre investment decisions with her inheritance while she couldn't do anything about it, except politely suggest things they'd promptly ignore. But wait, it gets worse. And if you thought woman can't control her own inheritance was the peak of 19th century nonsense, buckle up. Hetty's aunt, Sylvia Howland, her mother's unmarried sister who'd lived with the family and had her own substantial fortune, also died around this time. Sylvia had been fond of Hetty, and everyone assumed she'd leave her niece a significant inheritance. She did, sort of, in the most frustrating way possible. Sylvia left half her $2 million estate to various charities and institutions in New Bedford, spreading goodwill and ensuring her name would be on plaques for generations. The other half she placed in, you guessed it, another trust for Hetty, with Hetty receiving only the income and with male trustees controlling the principal. So now Hetty had approximately $8 million that was technically hers, but that she couldn't actually control. It was like being given the keys to a Ferrari, but being told you could only sit in it while someone else drove, and that someone else was consistently choosing to drive 15 miles under the speed limit in the left lane, while you screamed internally about the inefficiency. For anyone else, this might have been the end of the story. Take your trust income, which was still substantial, live comfortably, maybe marry someone who'd let you have opinions about the money, even though legally he'd control it, and call it a day. But Hetty Green was not anyone else. She was convinced that there was another will, a more recent will that Sylvia had written, one that left the entire estate directly to Hetty without trusts or trustees or any other paternalistic nonsense designed to protect women from their own supposed incompetence. And she was going to prove it existed, even if she had to turn the entire legal system upside down trying. This kicked off a legal battle that would last for years and become one of the most talked about court cases of the era. Hetty claimed she had this second will, actually had a physical document she presented to the court. The trustees claimed it was a forgery. Experts were called in to examine the handwriting using the cutting-edge forensic techniques of the 1860s, which probably involved squinting really hard and making educated guesses. There were accusations of fraud from both sides. It was basically the Victorian version of a true crime podcast, except instead of murder, it was about whether a rich lady had signed a piece of paper, which somehow still generated enough drama to fill newspapers for months. The case, Robinson vs. Mandel, dragged through courts for years. Hetty was fighting not just for money, she already had plenty of that flowing in from the trusts, but for control, for the right to manage her own inheritance, without a committee of men making decisions for her, like she was a child who needed supervision, for the simple revolutionary idea that she was competent to handle her own affairs without male oversight. She lost. The court ruled that the second will was a forgery, that Sylvia's original will stood, and that Hetty's inheritance would remain in trusts controlled by male trustees, who definitely knew better than her, despite all evidence to the contrary. It was a devastating loss, not just financially but personally. The court had essentially ruled that Hetty was either a liar or incompetent, neither of which was true, and that she couldn't be trusted with her own money, which is rich coming from a legal system that routinely allowed men to gamble away entire fortunes at cards. But here's the thing about Hetty Green. Losing in court just made her more determined to prove everyone wrong. If they wouldn't give her control of her inheritance through legal means, fine. She'd build her own fortune so large that the trust money would become irrelevant by comparison. She'd show them that she didn't need their permission, or their trusts, or their condescending protection, and she'd do it by being smarter, more disciplined, and more strategic than any of the men who just defeated her in court, which, let's be honest, probably wasn't that high a bar. But first, she needed to get married. Not because she wanted to, though she apparently didn't hate the guy, which in Victorian marriages was basically winning the lottery, but because a single woman in 1860s America with a fortune, even a fortune she couldn't fully control, was considered both vulnerable and dangerous. Vulnerable to con men who might try to trick her into marriage to steal her money, and dangerous because she represented a challenge to the natural order where money was supposed to be managed by men and women were supposed to smile and pretend math was hard. So, in 1867, when Hetty was 33 years old, which in Victorian terms was basically geriatric for an unmarried woman, though still younger than Leonardo DiCaprio's girlfriend, she married Edward Henry Green, known to everyone as Ned, which is one of those nicknames that doesn't make sense unless you understand that 19th century had very different ideas about how names should work, along with hygiene and medical care. Ned was 46, 13 years older than Hetty, and he was a millionaire in his own right from silk trading in Asia. He was charming, sociable, loved spending money on fine things, and was basically everything Hetty wasn't. On paper, they had absolutely nothing in common except money, which historically has been the foundation of many successful marriages among the wealthy, so who are we to judge their choices? But here's where Hetty did something absolutely unprecedented, something so radical that even today it would raise eyebrows among certain traditional families who think prenups show a lack of faith or commitment, or whatever excuse people use when they don't want to discuss money honestly. She made Ned sign a prenuptial agreement in 1867, when married women's property laws meant that everything a woman owned legally became her husband's property the moment they said, "I do." like some kind of financial identity theft that everyone pretended was romantic. When women couldn't vote, couldn't serve on juries, couldn't even have legal custody of their own children in most states. When the entire legal system was designed to ensure that women remained perpetual children under male guardianship, first their fathers and then their husbands. Hetty looked at this situation and said, "Absolutely not. Sign this document giving up all rights to my money or there's no wedding." And Ned, possibly because he was actually a decent guy, or possibly because he knew Hetty would never marry him otherwise and he liked her enough to accommodate her completely reasonable boundary, signed it. The prenup specified that their finances would remain completely separate. Hetty's money was Hetty's money. Ned's money was Ned's money. Neither had any claim on the other's fortune. It was essentially a business partnership masquerading as a marriage, which honestly describes a lot of wealthy marriages, but usually without the honesty of putting it in writing and acknowledging what everyone was really agreeing to. This document was so unusual that it made the newspapers because apparently a woman protecting her assets was more newsworthy than whatever war was happening at the time. People were shocked. How dare she? Didn't she trust her husband? What kind of marriage starts with contracts and lawyers? Wasn't love supposed to conquer all, including basic financial sense? But Hetty had learned from watching her father and grandfather and from her own disastrous experience with the court system. If you don't protect your money in writing, someone will take it from you. Trust is lovely for personal relationships, but for money, you need contracts. Romance is great, but assets require paperwork. Shortly after the wedding, Hetty and Ned left for London. Officially, this was so Ned could handle some business there, because wealthy men in the 1860s were always vaguely handling business in Europe. Unofficially, it was probably to avoid any potential fallout from the will case. There were hints that Hetty might face fraud charges over that disputed second will, and fleeing the country until the statute of limitations ran out was a time-honoured tradition among the wealthy accused of crimes, basically the Victorian version of checking into rehab until the scandal blows over. They lived in London for several years, where Hetty gave birth to 2 children, a son named Edward Howland Robinson Green Jr., who they called Ned because apparently they wanted maximum confusion at family gatherings, and a daughter named Sylvia, named after the aunt whose will had caused all that legal trouble, which is either touching sentiment or passive-aggressive reminder, depending on your interpretation. Life in London was pleasant. They lived well, though not extravagantly, because Hetty believed in not spending money just because you had it, a philosophy that would be completely alien to modern influences. And Hetty continued to manage her investments from abroad, which in the 1870s meant a lot of letters and telegrams, and waiting weeks for information that today we'd get in seconds on a phone, which really makes you appreciate how much easier insider trading is in the modern era. But here's what's important. During this time, Hetty was learning. She was studying markets, watching how the English financiers operated, understanding the patterns of boom and bust, and developing the investment philosophy that would eventually make her the richest woman in the world and prove that the trustees who'd refused to let her manage her own money were exactly as incompetent as she'd suspected. Her strategy was beautifully simple, the kind of simple that sounds obvious after someone explains it, but that nobody actually follows because it requires discipline. Buy when everyone else is selling. Sell when everyone else is buying. Wait for panics when people are desperate and assets are cheap. Hold cash reserves so she could take advantage of others' desperation. Be patient, be disciplined, and never let emotion drive investment decisions, which is excellent advice that approximately 0 people actually follow because humans are fundamentally irrational creatures who make financial decisions based on feelings and then justify them with logic later. It's the same strategy that Warren Buffett would later make famous. Be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. Except Hetty was doing it 50 years before Buffett was born, which means Buffett basically took Hetty's homework and got more credit for it because he was male, which tracks. By 1875, the statute of limitations on any potential fraud charges had expired, and Hetty and Ned returned to America with their 2 children, ready to rejoin society and pretend the whole fleeing to Europe to avoid potential prosecution thing had just been an extended vacation. They settled in New York, which was rapidly becoming the financial capital of the nation, the place where fortunes were made and lost with dizzying speed, and where absolutely nobody learned from other people's mistakes. And this is where Hetty's legend really begins, because now she had everything she needed: a strategy, capital, and the legal protection of a prenup that meant her husband couldn't interfere with her decisions. Ned, for his part, proceeded to lose most of his fortune through bad investments and what the newspapers euphemistically called unfortunate speculation, which is Victorian code for he made terrible decisions and lost all his money, but we're going to be polite about it. He made all the mistakes that get people in trouble: investing on emotion, chasing trends, trying to get rich quick instead of building wealth slowly. Basically doing everything Hetty specifically avoided. Hetty watched her husband burn through his millions and did absolutely nothing to stop him. Not because she was cruel or vindictive, but because they had a prenup. His money was his business. Her money was her business. He'd signed the document knowing this. She wasn't going to bail him out every time he made a bad investment, because that would defeat the entire purpose of keeping their finances separate. This seems harsh until you realize that if Hetty had shared her money with Ned, if she'd let him make decisions about her investments, or if she'd rescued him from his mistakes, she would have lost everything too. The prenup wasn't just protecting her assets, it was protecting her from his terrible judgment, like a financial firewall preventing his bad decisions from spreading to her portfolio. Eventually, Ned was essentially bankrupt, reduced to living on a salary from a railroad company and the occasional loan from friends who felt sorry for her. Meanwhile, Hetty was quietly building an empire, which probably made for some interesting dinner conversation. She started small and she started smart. While the Gilded Age was in full swing, the era of conspicuous consumption, of Fifth Avenue mansions that cost millions, of Newport cottages that were actually 40-room palaces, of competing to see who could waste the most money in the most ostentatious way possible. Hetty was buying unsexy, boring assets that nobody else wanted: foreclosed properties, defaulted mortgages, small railroads that had gone bankrupt, government bonds when everyone else thought they were too risky. She'd wait for panics, for moments when everyone was desperate to sell, and then she'd swoop in with cash offers like some kind of financial vulture. Except vultures get a bad rap. They're actually performing an important ecological function, much like Hetty was performing an important economic function by providing liquidity during crises. The thing about financial panics, and there were a lot of them in the Gilded Age because financial regulation was basically non-existent, is that they create incredible opportunities for people who have 2 things: ready cash and nerves of steel. When everyone is panicking and selling assets for pennies on the dollar because they need money immediately, the person who stays calm and has money to invest can build a fortune. It's like a going out of business sale, except for entire companies and property. Hetty had both. She kept massive cash reserves at a time when most wealthy people had their money tied up in investments and property and couldn't access it quickly, specifically so she could take advantage of others' desperation. And she had the emotional discipline to watch markets crash without panicking, because she understood that panics are temporary, but good assets eventually recover their value. It's the same psychology that lets some people buy during a stock market crash while everyone else is selling in terror. Except Hetty was doing this before there were financial advisors to explain behavioral economics to you. She'd buy properties that were being foreclosed, wait for the market to stabilize, and then either sell them for profit or hold them and collect rent. She'd lend money to cities and railroads that were desperate for capital, charging reasonable interest rates, usually 6% when she could have charged 40% and probably gotten away with it, because she understood that fair rates meant repeat business and a reputation for being someone people could trust, even if they also feared her slightly. This is important. Hetty was not a loan shark. She wasn't exploiting people's desperation by charging usurious rates. She charged fair interest, gave reasonable terms, and dealt honestly with her borrowers. She just also happened to keep immaculate records, never missed a payment deadline, and would absolutely foreclose on you if you didn't pay. Because fair doesn't mean soft and trustworthy doesn't mean pushover. She was fair but inflexible, which made her both trustworthy and slightly terrifying. The financial equivalent of a strict teacher who's hard but fair and whom you respect even as you're nervous about disappointing them. Her typical day, once she was in full tycoon mode, was absolutely bizarre by Gilded Age standards and would make for great reality TV if anyone wanted to do a period piece about financial management. Most wealthy women were sleeping until 9 or 10, having elaborate breakfasts brought to their rooms by servants, spending hours getting dressed with the help of multiple maids, and then maybe attending a luncheon or planning a dinner party. Basically, treating each day like a performance that required extensive preparation and costume changes. Hetty, she'd wake up early, eat a simple breakfast, usually oatmeal, which she'd cook herself to save money because why pay a cook when you have hands and a pot, and then head to the Chemical National Bank in Lower Manhattan to do actual work. Now here's where it gets weird, and by weird I mean perfectly logical if you think about it, but absolutely incomprehensible to everyone else. Hetty didn't rent an office. That would have cost money, and she saw no reason to pay rent for office space when the bank would let her work in their building for free. So she'd show up at the bank with trunks and suitcases full of her papers and ledgers, and she'd set up shop in a corner of the bank, sitting there all day reviewing documents, meeting with people who owed her money, making investment decisions, and managing her growing empire. Picture it, one of the richest women in America, worth tens of millions of dollars, sitting in a bank vault like some sort of Victorian bag lady, surrounded by literal trunks of papers, wearing the same black dress she'd been wearing for years, conducting high-stakes financial negotiations from a folding chair next to the safety deposit box. The press absolutely lost their minds over it, like full existential crisis levels of confusion and mockery. The image of Hetty in her shabby dress, working from a bank vault surrounded by trunks, became the cornerstone of her Witch of Wall Street reputation. Look at this miser. Look at this strange woman who has millions but works from a bank vault. What kind of person does this? Is she mentally ill? Is this what happens when women try to do business? The answer is someone who doesn't care what you think and is too busy making money to waste time on office rent and social conventions. Someone who's done the math and realized that paying for a fancy office would be spending money to impress people she doesn't like anyway. Someone who understands that the bank is happy to have her there because it makes them look good to have a wealthy depositor working on site. It's actually brilliant when you think about it, but thinking about it would require admitting that Hetty knew exactly what she was doing. Hetty's investment strategy was working spectacularly, which must have been incredibly annoying for all the male trustees who'd insisted she couldn't manage her own money. She was buying properties in New York, Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco. She was investing in railroads, not the glamorous transcontinental ones that everyone talked about, and that regularly went bankrupt, but small, local railroads that were actually profitable if managed correctly, which is a lesson many modern investors could learn about the difference between sexy investments and profitable. She was lending money to cities and states that needed capital for infrastructure projects, becoming essentially a one-woman municipal bond market, and she was doing it all herself. No male advisors whispering in her ear, no investment firm taking a percentage, no committee of trustees making decisions for her. Just Hetty, her ledgers, and a brain that could calculate compound interest faster than most men could read, which was both her superpower and the reason men found her threatening. By the 1880s, Hetty was worth tens of millions of dollars, far more than the trust money she'd been fighting over back in the 1860s, which must have been satisfying in a "I told you so" kind of way. She'd proven, through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance, that she didn't need anyone's permission or help to build a She'd taken approximately $6 million most of which she couldn't even control directly, and turned it into an empire worth potentially 10 times that, all while wearing the same dress and working from a bank vault because she had her priorities straight, and they didn't include impressing people at cocktail. But here's where the Witch of Wall Street nickname really took hold, and it's worth examining why this label stuck to Hetty so completely. While male financiers doing similar things were called titans and magnates, and other impressive-sounding nouns that suggest power rather than supernatural evil, the newspapers called her a witch primarily for one reason. She was a woman with power who refused to apologize. She refused to soften her competence with feminine charm. She refused to pretend to be less intelligent than she was. She refused to perform the elaborate rituals of femininity that were supposed to make powerful women palatable to men. She wore plain black dresses, not because she was poor. She could have bought every dress in New York if she wanted, but because she thought expensive fashion was stupid. She worked from a bank vault, not because she couldn't afford an office, but because she didn't see the point of paying rent to impress people. She traveled alone to collect debts. Scandalous for a woman. Not because she was desperate, but because she believed in managing her own business and didn't need a male chaperone to protect her delicate, feminine sensibilities from the rough world of finance. Every single thing the newspapers mocked her for was actually a business decision or a personal choice that would have been completely unremarkable in a man. Think about it. Really think about it. Because this is where the double standard becomes so obvious it's almost funny. A male financier who dressed simply and didn't waste money on expensive clothes, admired for his focus on substance over style, praised for understanding that true wealth doesn't need to advertise itself. A male financier who worked from a bank vault instead of renting expensive offices, clever, savvy, avoiding unnecessary overhead costs that cut into profit. A male financier who traveled alone on business, going wherever necessary to manage his investments, dedicated, hard-working, admirably hands-on in his approach. But Hetty doing these exact same things? Crazy, miserly, witch-like, unnatural, evidence of some fundamental wrongness, some inability to be a proper woman while also being a competent business person. The witch label was punishment for refusing to perform femininity the way women were supposed to. She didn't smile sweetly and defer to men. She didn't dress up and play society games. She didn't pretend to be less intelligent than she was. She didn't soften her business acumen with charm and flirtation. She didn't apologize for being good at what she did. She didn't perform helplessness or confusion to make men feel needed. She just did business, like men did business. And apparently, that was witchcraft. The newspapers competed to publish the most scandalous stories about Hetty's miserliness, each trying to outdo the others in tales of her supposed cheapness. They claimed she ate cold oatmeal because she was too cheap to heat it. Never mind that cold oatmeal is actually fine, and heating it is optional. They said she wore newspapers under her dress for warmth instead of buying warmer clothes, which sounds incredibly uncomfortable and is probably false, but made for good copy. They reported that she'd let her son's leg be amputated because she refused to pay for proper medical, a story that was completely false, easily disprovable, but too good for editors to fact-check because accuracy is less important than a compelling narrative that confirms everyone's biases. These stories took on a life of their own, getting repeated and embellished with each retelling until Hetty became almost a mythical figure. The wicked witch who hoarded gold in her bank vault and cackled over her ledgers while refusing to spend a single penny, like some kind of financial dragon sitting on a pile of treasure and terrorizing the good people of Wall Street. The reality was more complicated and far more interesting than the caricature, but reality rarely sells newspapers as well as sensational fiction. Yes, Hetty was frugal. She wore plain clothes, lived in modest apartments, didn't waste money on luxuries, but this wasn't because she was mentally ill or pathologically cheap. It was because she'd been raised in a Quaker household that viewed conspicuous consumption as morally wrong, and because she fundamentally believed that spending money just to show off was idiotic. And honestly, she had a point. She'd watched the Gilded Age elite build increasingly absurd mansions and throw increasingly wasteful parties, competing to see who could spend the most money on the most ridiculous things. The Victorian equivalent of modern billionaires racing to see who can launch themselves into space first. Except at least space travel has some scientific value, whereas a 250-room summer cottage you use twice a year has none. The Vanderbilts building a house with more rooms than most hotels. Idiotic. Mrs. Astor's balls that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars for one night of standing around in uncomfortable corset. Wasteful. The endless competition over who had the biggest yacht or the most expensive jewels, or could throw the most elaborate dinner party featuring live swans or whatever nonsense they came up with. Childish peacocking that accomplished nothing except proving you could set money on fire in creative ways. Hetty looked at this circus of conspicuous consumption and decided she'd rather have the actual money than the temporary prestige of spending it on nonsense. She'd rather be genuinely wealthy than perform wealth for people whose approval she didn't need. It's like choosing to have money in your bank account instead of designer handbags to photograph for Instagram, except Instagram didn't exist. So she was ahead of her time in understanding that real wealth is what you keep, not what you display. But here's what the miser stories missed, what got buried under all the tales of cold oatmeal and newspaper underwear. Hetty gave away quite a lot of money. She just did it quietly, without press releases or naming buildings after herself, or hosting elaborate charity balls, where the point was less about helping people and more about being seen helping people. She supported churches and charities. She helped families who were struggling financially, often paying rent or medical bills without fanfare. She even publicly supported the 1895 Brooklyn trolley workers' strike, which was radical for someone of her class, saying, "The poor have no chance in this country," which was a fairly bold statement for one of the richest women in America to make, and probably didn't endear her to her fellow tycoons who preferred to pretend poverty was a personal failing rather than a systemic issue. After her death, her son Ned would reveal that his mother had been far more generous than anyone knew, that she'd quietly supported many families and causes over the years, that the miser reputation was wildly exaggerated. But those stories didn't fit the witch narrative the press had built, so they got buried in favor of tales about how she supposedly wore the same petticoat until it literally fell apart, which sounds both uncomfortable and structurally unlikely. The truth is that Hetty's frugality served a strategic purpose beyond just saving money. It kept her cash reserves high, which meant she always had money available when opportunities arose. While other wealthy people had their money tied up in mansions that required small armies of servants to maintain, and yachts that cost fortunes to operate, and jewels that just sat in safes looking expensive, Hetty could write a check for $1 million tomorrow if a good investment appeared. That flexibility, that liquidity, was her superpower, like being able to fast travel in a video game while everyone else has to walk. And she'd need it for the biggest financial crisis of her life, the moment when all her strategic frugality and careful planning would prove their worth in the most dramatic way possible. The year was 1907, and Wall Street was in the early stages of what would become the Panic of 1907, a financial crisis so severe that it would eventually lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve, which tells you how badly the financial system was broken, that they had to essentially invent a new institution to prevent this from happening again. Though, spoiler alert, it would happen again anyway because humans are terrible at learning from history. Banks were failing, the stock market was crashing, trust companies were going under, and New York City itself, the largest, wealthiest city in America, was on the verge of bankruptcy, which would be like if today New York announced it couldn't make payroll and was considering selling the Brooklyn Bridge to whoever wanted it. This is the moment we opened with, but let's go deeper into what was actually happening, because financial panics are fascinating case studies in human psychology and how quickly confidence can collapse when everyone realizes the emperor has no clothes and also no cash reserves. The panic of 1907 started with a failed attempt to corner the market on copper stocks. Basically, some rich guys led by a banker named Augustus Heinze tried to buy up all the copper shares to artificially drive up the price and make a fortune, which is market manipulation and definitely illegal. But enforcement of financial regulations in 1907 was basically non-existent, so they figured they'd give it a try. Except their scheme failed spectacularly, like a group project where nobody did their part, and now you're all failing together, and they lost everything. This wouldn't normally crash the entire economy. Rich people losing money on stupid schemes is basically a Tuesday on Wall Street, except that they'd borrowed massive amounts of money to finance their copper corner, and when they couldn't pay it back, the lenders got worried, very worried. Maybe we should check if everyone else can pay us back too. Levels of worried. The lenders, mostly trust companies, which were like banks but with fewer regulations, because what could possibly go wrong, realized they might not get their money back. Depositors at these trust companies heard rumors about the copper scheme and got worried about their own money. Soon, there was a full-on bank run, with people lining up around the block to withdraw all their money at once, which banks fundamentally cannot handle, because the entire banking system is based on the premise that not everyone will want their money simultaneously. It's like if everyone tried to claim their coat from CoatCheck at the same time. There's only so many CoatCheck people and hooks, and eventually someone's going to be waiting a really long time or discover their coat went to someone else. Trust companies started failing. Then regular banks started, because panic spreads faster than reason. Then the contagion spread to the stock market, which crashed because nobody wanted to buy stocks when they weren't sure if banks would exist tomorrow to process the transaction. Then nobody wanted to lend money to anyone because they were afraid they wouldn't get paid back. And if nobody's lending money, the entire economy seizes up because modern capitalism runs on credit, like cars run on gasoline. The entire financial system was seizing up like an engine without oil, making horrible grinding noises that suggested imminent catastrophic failure. And New York City needed money. Specifically, the city needed to refinance some short-term debt that was coming due, about $30 million, which doesn't sound like that much compared to modern government spending, but was a fortune in 1907. Normally this would be easy. Banks would compete to lend to the city, seeing it as a safe investment because cities don't usually go bankrupt, and New York was the richest city in America. But in the middle of a panic, with banks failing and money disappearing into mattresses as people hoarded cash, nobody wanted to lend to anyone, not even to what was supposedly the safest borrower in the country. If the city couldn't refinance this debt, it would default. If New York City defaulted, it would trigger a complete collapse of confidence in municipal bonds across the country. If people lost faith in municipal bonds, they'd lose faith in state bonds. If they lost faith in state bonds, they'd probably lose faith in the dollar itself. We're talking Great Depression levels of disaster, except this was 1907, so the Great Depression hadn't happened yet and couldn't be used as a cautionary tale, though clearly it should have been because humans never learn. J.P. Morgan. Yes, that J.P. Morgan, the one they named a bank after, the man who was basically Wall Street personified, was trying to organize a group of financiers to pool their money and stabilize things. He'd already locked a bunch of them in his library, literally locked the doors and refused to let them leave until they agreed to help, which is a power move that probably wouldn't fly today, but was apparently acceptable in 1907 if you were rich enough. But even Morgan didn't have enough liquid capital available to solve the problem alone. He needed help from someone who had cash, lots of cash, readily available, and not tied up in investments or property or yachts or whatever rich men spent money on. He needed Hetty Green. So, J.P. Morgan, one of the most powerful financiers in the world, the man who essentially owned half of Wall Street and could make or break fortunes with a word, had to go to a 73-year-old woman in a worn black dress sitting in a bank vault surrounded by trunks of papers and ask, politely, for her help. The newspapers would later report that Morgan and the other titans of finance stood in Hetty's workspace with their hats in their hands, which in Victorian body language was the ultimate gesture of respect and supplication, like taking a knee or bowing. They weren't there as equal. They were there as people who needed something from her. They were begging, as elegantly as wealthy men in 1907 knew how to beg, which involved a lot of throat clearing and careful word choice, but was still fundamentally begging. These were men who'd spent decades dismissing Hetty as an eccentric, who'd called her a witch, who'd mocked her for wearing plain dresses and working from a bank vault, who'd probably laughed at the newspaper stories about her supposed miserliness, and agreed that, yes, women in business were peculiar creatures who didn't quite understand how things worked. And now they were standing in front of her, hats in hand, asking for money because their carefully constructed financial system was collapsing, and she was one of the few people who could help stop it. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Actually, you could probably cut it with one of those fancy silverware sets that wealthy people used at dinner parties, which Hetty didn't own because she thought they were a waste of money, which was looking pretty smart right about now. Hetty listened to their pitch. The city needed money. The financial system was in crisis. Banks were failing. Would she help? Could she help? Please help. And Hetty, who'd spent decades being called a witch and a miser, who'd been mocked relentlessly for her frugality and her refusal to spend money on fancy offices and expensive clothes, who'd been dismissed as an eccentric old woman playing at business while the real financiers, meaning men, did the important work, looked at these powerful men who were suddenly powerless and said yes. She wrote a check for $1. $1 million, about $35 million in today's money, which is buy a really nice house in Manhattan, money now, but was save an entire city from bankruptcy, money then, to buy short-term revenue bonds from New York City. The terms were fair. The interest rate was reasonable, 6% her standard rate, the same rate she always charged. It was a good investment, not charity. She wasn't doing this out of the goodness of her heart. She was doing it because it was a solid deal that would make her money. But it was also the check that kept the city from defaulting, which kept the panic from becoming a complete catastrophe, which meant Hetty Green had just saved New York City's economy. Let that sink in for a moment. The woman they called a witch. The woman they'd mocked for wearing the same black dress. The woman they'd dismissed as eccentric and strange. She'd just saved New York City. The newspapers suddenly had a problem, and it was a delicious problem to watch them try to solve. The witch they'd been gleefully mocking for years had just saved the city's economy. The miser had just demonstrated that her frugality had been strategic all along. She'd been maintaining massive cash reserves specifically so she could help in moments like this, or at least so she could take advantage of opportunities like this, which amounted to the same thing for the city's purposes. Some papers tried to frame it as her taking advantage of the crisis, as her exploiting desperate circumstances for profit. But that didn't really work because she'd charged fair rates. She could have demanded 40% interest. She could have held the city hostage and extracted whatever terms she wanted because they were desperate and she knew it. But she charged her standard 6%, same as always. It's hard to accuse someone of exploitation when they're charging the same rate they always charge. Some tried to maintain the witch narrative because changing their entire framing after decades of mockery would require admitting they'd been wrong, and newspapers in 1907 were no better at admitting mistakes than media outlets today. But it's hard to call someone a witch when they just saved your city. Evil witch rescues major metropolis from financial ruin doesn't quite work as a headline. Most eventually settled on something like grudging respect, though they couldn't quite let go of the idea that there was something strange about this woman who had so much power. She was still called the Witch of Wall Street in headlines. That nickname was too good to drop, too memorable, too perfectly encapsulated. But now there was a hint of respect in it, sometimes even admiration. She'd proven that the witch had been the smartest person in the room all along. What the newspapers missed, or deliberately ignored, because it would require them to admit they'd been wrong about her for decades, is that Hetty had been doing this for years. This wasn't her first rodeo saving cities or banks or companies from financial crises. She'd lent money to cities and states during previous panics. She'd provided capital when banks wouldn't, often at rates more reasonable than the banks would have charged. She was essentially functioning as a one-woman Federal Reserve, stepping in during crises to provide liquidity and stability, doing the job that the government would later create an entire institution to handle. The reason she could do this, the reason she had money available when JP Morgan and all the other titans of Wall Street were scrambling to find cash, was specifically because of all the things they'd mocked her. The frugal lifestyle meant lower expenses, which meant more money available for investment. The refusal to rent expensive offices meant more capital available for loans. The black dress she wore for years meant she wasn't wasting money on fashion that could be earning interest. The simple meals she cooked herself meant she wasn't spending thousands on elaborate dinner parties that accomplished nothing except proving you could afford elaborate dinner parties. Every single thing they'd called her crazy for doing was actually part of a coherent strategy to maintain flexibility and power in a financial system that was prone to panics. She'd been playing a different game than everyone else, while they were competing to see who could spend the most money on the most impressive displays. She was quietly accumulating power in the form of liquid assets that could be deployed when everyone else was desperate. She'd won the game by refusing to play it their way. After the 1907 crisis, Hetty's reputation shifted slightly. She was still called the Witch of Wall Street, but now the nickname carried different weight. Those who knew her well, the bankers she'd dealt with, the borrowers who'd paid her back on time, the cities she'd lent money to, started calling her the Queen of Wall Street instead. Same woman, different framing, vastly different connotations. Witch suggests evil and danger. Queen suggests power and respect. She'd forced Wall Street to respect her by being the only one prepared for disaster. Hetty continued working until her health began to fail, which wasn't until her 70s because apparently all that oatmeal and frugal living was actually good for longevity. Or maybe she was just too stubborn to die while there were still bad investments to avoid and good deals to make. She still went to her bank vault most days, still reviewed her ledgers with the same sharp intelligence she'd always had, still managed her investments with the discipline that had made her wealthy. Her children were grown and leading their own lives, as children tend to do when you don't lock them in rooms or control every aspect of their existence. Ned Jr. and her son had become a colourful character in his own right. He had a collection of exotic pets, including a monkey, which seems appropriate given his mother's reputation, and he owned multiple estates and had a fondness for spending money that was the exact opposite of his mother's frugality. He collected cars and radios and all manner of expensive toys, basically doing everything his mother had refused to do. But Ned Jr. was also smart enough to let his mother manage most of the family fortune, recognizing that she was better at it than he'd ever be, and that his strengths lay elsewhere, specifically in spending rather than making money. It's actually a healthy recognition of one's own limitations. He knew he liked spending money on fun things, so he let his mother handle the making money part, and everyone was happier. Sylvia, her daughter, had never married and lived quietly, avoiding the spotlight that had followed her mother throughout her life. The two women were close, though Sylvia kept her distance from the financial world that fascinated Hetty. Some daughters rebel by doing drugs or running away. Sylvia rebelled by being boringly normal and refusing to have opinions about bond yield. In 1916, at the age of 81, which is pretty good for someone born in 1834, when medical care consisted mostly of hoping for the best and occasionally applying leeches, Hetty Green died at her son's home in New York. The cause was listed as a stroke, which isn't surprising for someone who'd spent 50 years in the high-stress world of finance and who'd probably elevated her blood pressure considerably every time she read another newspaper article calling her a witch. Her estate was valued at approximately $100 to $200 million. The exact amount is unclear because Hetty had been notoriously secretive about her holdings, had purchased properties under various names like some kind of financial spy, and had investments scattered across the country like a very boring treasure hunt. In today's money, we're talking somewhere between $2 to $6 billion, which is Jeff Bezos's weekend spending money in modern terms, but which in 1916 made her unquestionably the richest woman in America and one of the richest people period, regardless of gender. The press immediately went into overdrive with retrospectives of her life, and they were about what you'd expect, a mix of the witch and miser narratives they'd been pushing for decades, with a healthy dose of, but also, she was kind of brilliant, and we're not sure how to reconcile that with all the mockery we did. It's the journalistic equivalent of sorry not sorry, where you acknowledge someone was impressive while still maintaining that there was something weird about them, so you don't have to fully admit you were wrong. But something else was happening too, something more interesting than the predictable newspaper retrospectives. Financial professionals, actual serious investors and financiers, started looking at her investment record with genuine interest. Value investors began analyzing her strategies, recognizing patterns that would become foundational to modern investing. People started realizing that Hetty hadn't just been lucky or crazy. She'd been a genuine pioneer in the field, a financial innovator who'd developed strategies that were decades ahead of their time. She'd bought low and sold high, which sounds obvious, but which almost nobody actually does, because it requires buying when everyone else is selling, and you feel like an idiot going against the crowd. She'd maintained cash reserves for liquidity, which meant she could invest when others couldn't. She'd focused on undervalued assets with strong fundamentals rather than chasing trendy investment. She'd been patient, disciplined, and willing to be contrarian. She'd never let emotion drive her investment decision, which is basically impossible for most humans who make financial choices based on fear and greed and then justify them with logic after the fact. These are all principles that modern value investing is built on, and Hetty had been practicing them decades before Benjamin Graham wrote the book that would establish value investing as a formal discipline. She'd been doing Warren Buffett's investment strategy before Warren Buffett was born, which means she invented a whole approach to investing that other people would later get famous for, which tracks because women's contributions often get forgotten or attributed to men who came later. Her children inherited the fortune equally as specified in her will, which was straightforward and didn't involve any trusts or complicated provisions because Hetty trusted her own children to manage money even if nobody had trusted. The irony of this, that Hetty, who'd spent years fighting trustees who wouldn't let her control her own inheritance, simply gave her children their money directly without restrictions, was apparently lost on most people, but is actually pretty beautiful when you think about it. Ned Jr. proceeded to spend his inheritance with enthusiasm, buying more cars and radios and exotic animals, and generally having the time of his life. When he died in 1936, he left his remaining inheritance to his sister Sylvia, because apparently he'd finally run through enough of it to realize she was the responsible. Sylvia, who'd lived quietly throughout her mother's life and after, inherited everything and promptly gave most of it away to charity. Hospitals, schools, churches, universities, she funded them all, distributing the fortune that her mother had built and that her brother had partially spent. She died childless in 1951, which meant the Hetty Green fortune was ultimately distributed to benefit thousands of people through charitable, which is probably not what Hetty had planned, but is a better legacy than another generation of wealthy people buying yachts. So here's what we're left with. Hetty Green, the witch of Wall Street, who wore the same black dress and worked from a bank vault and was mocked relentlessly for refusing to perform femininity the way women were supposed to, who saved New York City's economy and pioneered investment strategies that would later make other people famous, who died the richest woman in the world and whose fortune eventually funded hospitals and schools and countless charitable causes. She never apologized for being smarter than the men around her. She never softened her competence with charm. She never pretended to need guidance or protection. She never wasted money on impressing people whose opinion she didn't value. She never let anyone else control her money or her decisions. And she won. Completely, totally, undeniably won. The men who'd mocked her came to her for money when they needed it. The financial strategies they'd dismissed as the eccentricities of a strange woman turned out to be brilliantly sound investing principles. The frugality they'd called pathological was actually strategic discipline. The witch they'd feared and ridiculed was the smartest person in the room all along. So, when you hear about the Witch of Wall Street, remember, the witch was smarter than all of them, richer than all of them, and laughing all the way to the bank, specifically to the Chemical National Bank, where she worked from a vault because office rent was a waste of money she could be investing instead. Good night.